After 35 years of marriage, he looked me in the eye and said, "I never loved you." I remember the exact sound of the spoon stirring the sugar into his coffee. The way the morning light hit the side of his face. It was quiet, so painfully quiet, that when Victor said those words, it took a full breath before they registered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He just said it like it was a casual fact, like commenting on the weather. "I don't think I ever loved you, Elenya. I think I just liked the idea of you." That sentence didn't hit like a bullet. It was slower than that, more like a needle sliding in, too small to scream over, but deep enough to stay. I didn't speak. Not right away. I just stared at him, at the steam rising from his cup, at the hand that used to hold mine during church services when we were young and new and still trying. He didn't look up. He stirred and took a sip. Just another Tuesday. I got up quietly from the table, walked to the hallway, closed our bedroom door behind me and leaned my head against it. My knees didn't buckle. My hands didn't shake. That would come later. What I felt in that moment was strange. Like something inside me had been waiting for this, waiting for him to finally say what he'd been showing me for years. But it still broke something, not just because of the words, but because of how little they seemed to cost him. 35 years, 2 children, family holidays, health scares, nights spent waiting for him to come home from late trials, empty anniversaries dressed in silk and fake smiles. And now, this. A sentence dropped like a coin into a jar that had long been filling with everything unsaid. I walked to the back room, the room he used to call my space, though I hadn't touched a brush or written a word in that art nook in over a decade. I pulled open the drawer of the old filing cabinet where I had stashed away relics of a woman I used to be. Photos, letters, a half-finished manuscript written long before the kids were born. I ran my hand across the title page. The words felt like a lifeline. His hollow vows. It was the name I had once dreamed of for a novel. Back then, I thought it was dramatic, symbolic maybe. Now it just felt honest. I hadn't written fiction in years. Life had been too full of chores, appointments, expectations, and holding everything together while feeling more like wallpaper than a wife. I sat on the floor and flipped open the manuscript, the first sentence half finished. My handwriting curved, softer than I remembered. The husband was present in the room, but his love was not. My breath caught. It was like my past self was whispering back through time. She saw it coming. She had always known. A tear slipped down my cheek. Not for Victor. Not even for the marriage. It was for the woman I used to be. The woman who once wrote sentences like that and believed someone would cherish them. I had been quiet for so long. Too long. And still. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone to cry or rage or beg for comfort. Instead, I folded the manuscript, slid it into a brown envelope, and walked it to the living room where Victor still sat. Now watching the news, like we hadn't just snapped a marriage in half over breakfast. "I'll be gone for a few days," I said flatly. "Don't worry about dinner." He looked up briefly, blinked, nodded, and that was it. He didn't ask where, he didn't ask why. Maybe he thought I was bluffing. Maybe he thought it didn't matter. But for me, it was the start of something sacred, something silent, but alive. As I closed the front door behind me, I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel brave. I felt numb, but I held that envelope tight in my arms like it was a child I had forgotten I'd given birth to, a piece of me that had survived all these years of erasure. And as I drove toward my sister Ria's house, windows rolled down, cool air cutting across my face, I whispered aloud for the first time, "I think I'm done." Not with pain. That would linger. Not with grief. That had just begun. But with pretending, with fading, with swallowing myself every time someone else needed to shine. I was done with being invisible. And somewhere, deep inside, A voice I hadn't heard in years whispered back, "Then let them see you." Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before everything cracked open, before the silence became unbearable, my life looked ordinary, safe even. I was Mrs. Elenia Rowe, wife of the successful Victor Rowe, partner at Claiborne and Rowe, attorneys at law. We had a 2-story colonial-style home in Hartford, Connecticut, with white shutters and a porch swing I used to sit on every spring, reading the same books over and over. To the outside world, we were a strong, stable couple, the kind of marriage people described as solid. Not passionate, not wild, but dependable, respectable. Our children were grown. Mariel, our daughter, lived in San Francisco and worked as a financial analyst. She took after Victor in every way, precise, ambitious, emotionally reserved. Then there was Caleb, our son, softer, gentler, a music teacher who once told me, "You were the only reason our home felt safe growing up." I held on to that sentence for years. Our marriage began in the glow of late-20s optimism. Victor was charming in the way men in courtrooms learn to be. Calculated, quick-witted, magnetic. When he chose me, I felt chosen. Special. Like I'd been picked from the crowd. I mistook attention for affection and promises for proof. He never yelled, never raised a hand. He wasn't cruel in any dramatic way. But over the years, I learned how deeply someone could make you feel small without ever saying the words out loud. Still, I did what I believed a good wife does. I supported his career. I kept the house running. I memorized his coffee order, ironed his shirts, and stood quietly at his side during firm galas. I let him speak over me. I laughed when his jokes landed on me in public. I let his world swallow mine. My world was one of details, little sacrifices no one noticed but me, like how I gave up a full scholarship to pursue writing because Victor got a job offer in Boston and we couldn't both be chasing dreams, like how I gave birth to our children without him in the room, once because of a trial, once because he didn't handle blood well, like how every Mother's Day the flowers were sent by his secretary with the same generic note, "Thanks for all you do." I kept those notes, even as they hollowed me out. But I told myself, this is what loyalty looks like. This is what commitment means. I thought if I just stayed kind, stayed patient, stayed useful, he'd eventually soften. That one day I'd wake up and he'd see me again, not just the wife or the mother of his children, but the woman who once made him laugh without effort. He never did. But denial is a powerful drug. And for a long time, I was addicted to the version of our life that existed only in my head. I hosted the book club once a month in our sunroom, served lemon scones and lavender tea. The women always complimented my decor. "You have such a peaceful home," they'd say. I smiled, knowing peace was easier to fake than explain. On Sundays, Victor would watch his political programs while I gardened alone. We rarely touched, unless it was a photo at a family gathering. Our kisses were air-thin, our conversations transactional. But in the small moments, the mornings he'd bring my tea without asking, the rare nights we'd fall asleep shoulder to shoulder watching an old documentary, I'd let hope flicker. I'd tell myself, this is enough. I'd whisper, it's just a phase. I'd say, he's just tired, stressed, distracted. I didn't want to believe I had built a life around someone who never truly welcomed me into his heart. It was easier to believe he once loved me and simply forgot how, because the truth, that he never did, would have shattered me. I didn't talk about it. Not to my friends, not even to Rhea, my sister, who saw more than I ever admitted. She once asked me, when was the last time he really looked at you? I brushed her off. Changed the subject. We were taught to protect our marriages, not examine them. So I protected mine, fiercely. Even when I felt like I was vanishing inside it. There's a kind of grief that begins long before the goodbye, a slow fade, A feeling of watching your life from the outside, wondering when you stopped being the main character. That was me, long before Victor ever spoke those words. But in those days, I still believed in the image, still clung to the idea that I had made it. A good home, a good man, a good life. Even if it meant losing little pieces of myself along the way. It happened during a dinner party. One of those firm gatherings where everyone wore wine-colored sweaters and used words like networking and acquisition over baked brie. Victor loved those evenings. He was in his element, confident, respected, surrounded by colleagues who adored his sharp mind and subtle jabs. I had always played the supporting role. I wore the necklace he picked. I prepared the guest list. I made sure the flowers matched the wine glasses and that no one's glass stayed empty for long. But that night, something shifted. I was standing near the fireplace, chatting with one of the new junior associate's wives about her 2-year-old's tantrums, when I heard Victor's voice cut through the room. "And Elenya, she's our resident daydreamer, spends more time talking to roses than to people." Laughter followed, a ripple, small and polite. But I froze. He was across the room, glass in hand, smirking. It was meant to be charming, playful maybe, but it wasn't. It was the way he said it, like I was a curiosity, an odd decorative thing he lived with. Not a partner, not a person, just a woman who drifted around the edges of his real life. I managed a smile. I even chuckled, the kind of practiced laugh you offer when everyone's watching and you can't afford to make it awkward. But inside, something folded. That comment should have rolled off me. After all, it wasn't the first time he'd said something like that. Over the years, there had been jokes about how I didn't get politics, or how I was sweet but hopeless with directions, or how I couldn't finish a sentence without quoting a novel. I used to think they were harmless, just the kind of light-teasing couples did after decades together. But that night, I looked around the room and realized something chilling. He wasn't teasing me. He was positioning me. To them, I wasn't Elenya, a woman with thoughts and desires and a quiet fire. I was Victor's soft-spoken, flower-gardening, harmless wife, and he liked it that way. I excused myself, blaming a headache. Walked into the kitchen and stood by the sink, staring out the window into the darkness. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. I looked fine, polished even. But I felt exposed. The kitchen was silent, the hum of voices behind the wall muffled. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass. It wasn't about the joke. It was about the casualness with which he reduced me, and the casualness with which everyone accepted it. When I returned to the party, I watched him differently. The way he leaned in to talk to his colleague's wife. The way he laughed at jokes I knew he didn't find funny just weeks ago. The way he poured drinks for others but didn't look for me once. And I noticed something else, too. I wasn't missed. No one asked where I went. No one noticed I hadn't spoken in an hour. I used to think invisibility came from aging, that it was natural for women to fade a little after 50. But that night, I understood something deeper. I had not faded. I had been erased. Gradually, but intentionally. Victor didn't want a partner who challenged him, or matched his energy, or needed to be heard. He wanted a reflection, a muted echo of himself. When the guests finally left and I began cleaning up, Victor leaned against the counter and said, "You were quiet tonight. You all right?" I opened my mouth to answer. I wanted to say, that joke wasn't okay. I felt small tonight. I felt alone in a room full of people I fed. But what came out was just tired. He kissed the top of my head and walked upstairs. I stood there for a long time, wiping the same wine ring off the granite over and over, even after it had disappeared. That was the first red flag I couldn't unsee. Not because it was explosive, but because it was ordinary, an ordinary cruelty. The kind that hides in plain sight is the hardest to name. But I felt it that night, deep in my chest. The beginning of the end never comes like thunder. It comes like a whisper you finally decide to hear. There was no explosion, no affair, no shouting match that tore through the walls of our house. Instead, it was a slow undoing. Victor didn't stop loving me, because the truth was he never started. But what did happen, little by little, was that he stopped pretending. The small things went first, like how he used to ask if I slept well in the mornings. He stopped doing that. Now he just grunted into his coffee and read court briefs like I wasn't sitting 6 feet from him, or how he used to rest his hand on my lower back when we'd walk into restaurants. An unconscious gesture that made me feel chosen, connected. That vanished too. We walked side by side like polite strangers heading toward the same table. When I'd mentioned something about my day, a funny moment at the grocery store, or something the neighbor's cat did, he'd nod absently or say, "Huh," without looking up. It became easier not to speak at all. I stopped wearing lipstick. He didn't notice. I started leaving notes on the fridge reminding him to call Marielle. He never mentioned them. I cooked less. He ordered more takeout. Neither of us addressed the shift. It was like we were roommates sharing a mortgage, not a marriage. Evenings were the worst. That used to be our time, back in the beginning. We'd sit on the couch and talk about anything. He'd let me read poetry aloud, even if he didn't care for it. I'd listen to him rant about cases that I barely understood, just to be close. But now? He'd watch TV with the volume low, his phone glowing in his hand. I'd sit nearby reading or folding laundry, pretending I was content. We barely made eye contact. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was vacant. There were no arguments. That's what made it so confusing. How do you grieve something that never breaks loudly? I tried, I truly did. One morning, I surprised him with tickets to a jazz concert, an artist we had listened to during the first year of our marriage. I wrapped them in a little box, placed it next to his coffee. He opened the lid, blinked, then smiled faintly. "Jazz, huh? That's sweet of you." That was it. No excitement, no plans. He never mentioned it again. The tickets expired in a drawer 3 months later. One evening, I stood behind him while he was on a call, looking down at the back of his head. He was laughing. Not a fake laugh either, a full one. And it struck me how rare that sound was when he was with me. Who was he when I wasn't around? That's when I began to understand that I was no longer part of his world. Not in the way that mattered. I was background, set dressing, predictable and comfortable, like an old coat you don't wear anymore but refuse to throw away. Sometimes I'd test it. I'd wear a new dress, cook something different, even speak more firmly just to see if it shook him. It never did. The one time I said, "I feel like we don't talk anymore." He replied without lifting his eyes from his phone, "We've been married 30 years, Elenya. What more is there to say?" That crushed me. Not because he was wrong, but because he thought being married meant we had finished knowing each other. That same week, Caleb came over for lunch. He walked into the kitchen and found me sitting at the table staring at nothing, half a sandwich untouched in front of me. He said, "Mom, you okay?" I smiled quickly. "Of course. Just tired." He watched me. "You always say that now." That stayed with me. The way he said it, like he didn't quite believe me anymore. I began writing again in secret. Little journal entries, just for myself. I never mentioned Victor by name, just wrote about a woman who felt like a ghost in her own home. I didn't even know why I wrote it. Maybe to remember that I still had a voice. One entry read, she had become an expert in vanishing quietly. Her sorrow was not loud. It folded neatly next to the clean laundry and tucked itself under dinner plates. That was how it felt. I wasn't being abused. I wasn't being abandoned. I was just being erased. In moments when I dared to look too closely at our life, I would feel panic rise in my chest, like I was trapped inside a snow globe, smiling while everything froze. I thought about leaving sometimes, but the thought made me feel ridiculous. What would I tell people? That I left a man who didn't yell, didn't cheat, didn't hit, just didn't see me. So I stayed. And slowly, I stopped expecting anything more. No flowers, no warmth, no glances across a room that made me feel beautiful. Just shared space, shared bills, shared silence. If someone had looked at us from the outside, they would have seen a couple growing older together, comfortable, stable. But they would have missed what I felt every morning as I made our coffee, that I had become a ghost. Perfectly timed, always present, never heard. It was our 35th wedding anniversary. I had spent the afternoon curling my hair, carefully applying a soft blush, and choosing a deep green wrap dress that still made me feel a little elegant, even at 63. Victor didn't notice the dress or the hair. He simply asked, "You ready?" while scrolling through emails on his phone. We drove to the restaurant in silence, not the comfortable kind, but the kind where you start rehearsing fake smiles. I looked out the window at passing trees, and for some reason I thought about our first anniversary. The way he held my hand in the back seat of the cab, how he whispered that marrying me was the smartest thing he ever did. That version of him had vanished long ago. Maybe he never really existed, but I remembered that night more clearly than what I'd eaten for lunch. Victor had made a reservation at Maison Fleur, one of those upscale places with white linen tablecloths and water poured from glass bottles, the kind of place that speaks in soft jazz and polished silver. He was meeting two of his old college friends there, Colin and Janice. They had always liked Victor. Janice once told me, "Victor is the kind of man people trust instantly." I used to beam when people said things like that. Now I wondered if he just knew how to act the part better than most. We sat across from each other. He ordered the red wine without asking if I still preferred white. I didn't correct him. Janice arrived wearing a long gold shawl, full of stories about her daughter's new husband. Colin followed, loud and amused by his own anecdotes. The table filled with laughter quickly. I nodded, smiled, made the appropriate comments. Then, somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees, Victor raised his glass and said, "Here's to 35 years with Elenya, the most loyal woman I know, always steady, always predictable." There was a pause. Janice laughed first, then Colin. I blinked. Victor smiled, satisfied with himself. "Truly, she's like a lighthouse, always shining in the same spot, never moves, no surprises." I sat frozen, fingers wrapped around the stem of my untouched wine glass. Predictable, steady, never moves. It was meant as a compliment. At least, that's how it sounded on the surface. But every word stung like a pinch you pretend doesn't hurt. He didn't say I was passionate, or loving, or brilliant. He didn't say I challenged him, or made life better. He said I was predictable, like a household appliance, like someone who never once surprised him in 35 years. The shame rose hot in my chest. I forced a smile, pretending to be flattered. That's what I had always done. Laugh along even as my insides screamed. I felt like I was shrinking right there at the table. Janice turned to me and said, "That's such a rare quality, Elenya. You must be the glue." I nodded, the corners of my mouth twitching into a performance I'd perfected over decades. Inside, I felt like a cracked glass, still standing but fragile. Dinner went on. Victor laughed, poured more wine, made comments about legal cases and real estate deals. I drifted. At one point, I excused myself and went to the restroom. I stood at the sink, staring into the mirror. My mascara was intact. My lipstick hadn't smudged. But something about my reflection felt unfamiliar. I didn't see a woman celebrating 35 years of partnership. I saw someone who had become invisible in her own story. And the worst part, I had allowed it. I stayed in that restroom for 5 minutes, not crying, not breaking down, just breathing, trying to find myself in that mirror. I whispered under my breath, "You are not furniture. You are not wallpaper. You are not invisible." When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on. Victor didn't notice my absence. He was too busy talking about golf plans with Colin. I sat down quietly and began slicing the salmon I no longer had an appetite for. The rest of the dinner passed like background noise. The clinking of forks, the rise and fall of polished conversation. I didn't speak much. I don't think anyone noticed. As we walked to the car, Victor said, "That went well. They always like you." I nodded. He started the engine and adjusted the GPS, even though we were going home, the same route we had taken 100 times. And still, not once that evening did he ask how I felt. Not once did he say he loved me. That was the night something inside me went completely still, not broken, not shattered, just still, like a lake that had finally gone cold. It wasn't just the toast, it was what it represented. That after 3.5 decades, the best he could say about me was that I was consistent, like a habit, like a clock. It was the humiliation of realizing that while I had memorized the sound of his breathing, the way he liked his eggs, the tension in his shoulders after a hard day, he had only ever memorized my silence. And in public, he used that silence as a punchline. That night, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling fan. Victor snored softly beside me. I watched the blade spin and thought to myself, this will be the last anniversary I pretend to celebrate. 2 mornings after our anniversary dinner, I stood in the laundry room folding one of Victor's dress shirts. White, stiff collar, the same kind he always wore to court. I used to starch and press them with care, as if I were polishing his armor. But that morning, I stared at the fabric and asked myself a question I'd been afraid to say out loud for years. What would happen if I just stopped? Not stopped loving him. Because truthfully, I didn't know if I did anymore, but stopped being the one who kept it all running, the one who filled the silence, softened the edges, made excuses for the coldness. What would happen if I simply removed myself? Would he even notice? That afternoon, I asked Victor casually over lunch, "Do you ever think about how we got here?" He barely looked up from his tablet. "Got where?" 35 years, I said. "Do you ever look back and think about us?" He didn't respond immediately. Then he sighed. "I think we did what we were supposed to do, raised kids, paid bills, stayed together. That's more than most people manage." The way he said it, flat like reading a weather forecast, made something inside me go still. I cleared the dishes. Not another word was exchanged. That night, I sat alone in the den and opened a leather-bound journal I hadn't touched since Caleb's high school graduation. I wrote one sentence. He loved the life I made, not the woman who made it. I didn't cry, I didn't tremble, I simply knew. I was done being a fixture in someone else's life. The next day, while Victor was at the golf course, I began packing. Not loudly, not hastily. I took the clothes I felt most myself in. Soft sweaters, a scarf Caleb had given me, the navy blouse Victor had once called too artsy. I didn't pack photo albums. I left our wedding portrait right where it hung in the hallway, its polished frame gleaming under the morning sun like nothing had changed. I took my books, my journals, my old half-finished manuscript, crinkled and yellowing at the edges, and the laptop I hadn't opened in years. Everything else I left untouched. I called my sister Ria. She answered on the second ring. "Is it time?" she asked, as if she'd been waiting for this call all along. "I think so," I whispered. Her voice softened. "Come, just come. I've already made the bed." By the time Victor returned home, I was gone. No note. No confrontation. Just absence. I didn't owe him an exit scene. I didn't want to give him the performance he probably expected. The weeping wife, the dramatic suitcase at the door, the whispered accusations, and the "how dare you" speeches. He didn't deserve my heartbreak in high definition. He deserved my absence. And for the first time in my life, I gave him nothing. I drove through the early evening. Windows rolled down. The wind moved through my hair, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. I felt weightless, not happy. Not yet. but unhooked. When I reached Ria's place, a little cottage outside New Haven, she opened the door before I knocked. She didn't ask questions. She just hugged me so tightly I felt all the grief I'd buried rise to the surface. "I didn't even scream," I said against her shoulder. "You don't have to scream," she replied. "You just have to mean it." We drank tea on her porch that night. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't give any. She knew enough. She'd known for years. "You stayed longer than most would," she said gently. "I stayed until I didn't know who I was without him," I replied. "And now, I think I'm ready to remember." That night, I lay in her guest bed, soft sheets, a small reading lamp, the scent of lavender, and listened to the quiet. It was a different quiet than the one I had lived in for years. This one wasn't empty. It was mine. I realized then that I hadn't just walked away from a man. I had walked away from a version of myself I no longer recognized. The obedient wife, the pleasant hostess, the woman who swallowed her voice to keep peace that never really existed. I had walked away from the woman who believed staying was nobler than becoming whole. And as I stared at the ceiling, I whispered to no one in particular, "I'm not going back. Not to the house, not to the silence, not to the woman I had trained myself to be." Victor may not have said the words that day, but I finally understood the truth behind all those years of distance. He had never seen me. Not really. And I had stopped seeing myself, too. But now I was in a different place. Not just a different house, a different life. And this time, I wasn't going to fade into the background. This time, I was going to write myself back into the story. The first few days at Ria's house felt like coming down from anesthesia. I moved slowly, my body unfamiliar, my thoughts tangled and dull. Her little cottage sat on the edge of a wooded trail, quiet except for the distant sounds of birds and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. There were no court briefcases left on the table, no half-hearted questions, no heavy silences, just stillness. But the stillness didn't bring peace. Not at first. I woke each morning disoriented, half expecting Victor's slippers by the door or his coffee mug sitting crooked on the counter. My hand reached instinctively toward the right side of the bed, only to find empty space. And even though I had left him, truly left, there was something about his absence that felt just as painful as his presence. That's the thing no one tells you. Sometimes, leaving hurts just as much as staying. You don't just walk away from a man. You walk away from the version of yourself that clung to him. And she doesn't go quietly. I spent hours sitting on Ria's back porch, wrapped in an old wool shawl, staring at nothing in particular. Trees, fence lines, a cracked bird bath with no birds. Ria would come out, hand me tea, and sit beside me without filling the silence. She understood. She always had. "I feel blank," I whispered one afternoon. "You're not blank," she said. "You're bruised. There's a difference." I nodded, but I didn't feel bruised. I felt erased. Even the things I used to enjoy, reading, tending to plants, writing little lines in my journal, felt distant, like relics from a past life. I couldn't focus. I couldn't feel anything deeply except exhaustion and guilt. Guilt. That surprised me most of all. Not guilt for leaving Victor, but guilt for not leaving sooner. For all the years I allowed myself to shrink to fit into a role I had outgrown. For all the dinners I smiled through, all the conversations I let die without a second breath, all the moments I told myself, "This is just marriage. This is what long love looks like." But it wasn't love. Not the kind that sees you, not the kind that hears you. I sat on the floor of Ria's spare room one night with an open suitcase, not because I was repacking, but because I didn't know what else to do. Inside were the pieces of my life I had chosen to bring with me. My old journals, a faded photo of Caleb playing piano when he was 10, the manuscript I hadn't touched since my early 30s. I pulled it out and stared at the first page, his hollow vows, by Elenya Rowe. My name looked foreign on the page, like it belonged to someone else. Someone braver. I closed it and set it aside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up and stood in the hallway, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I looked tired, older. But there was something else in my eyes. Something hollow. I miss my children. Mariel hadn't called since my anniversary. Not that I expected her to. She was Victor's daughter in so many ways. Strong, private, loyal to a fault. I knew she wouldn't understand. Not yet. Caleb had texted once, "Heard you left. Are you okay?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. What could I say? Yes, I'm okay. I just don't know who I am anymore. Yes, I'm okay. I've become a ghost that finally walked out of the house. Instead, I turned off my phone and sat in the guest room, knees drawn to my chest like a child, and let the silence press against me. That was rock bottom. Not the day I left, not the night of the cruel toast, but the moment I realized I had no idea what came next. I had built my life around Victor, around our marriage, our routines, our family. Without it, I felt unanchored. I wasn't even sure I knew how to be Elenya anymore, not without his shadow next to me. There was a moment, just a moment, when I thought of going back. Not because I missed him, but because I missed certainty. The kind that comes with knowing who you're supposed to be, even if that version is quietly dying inside. But I didn't. Instead, I stood up, walked to the dresser, took out my journal. I didn't write anything profound that night. Just a list. Things I know are still true. I love strong tea with honey. I used to laugh until my ribs hurt. I once dreamed of writing a novel. I raised 2 children who are good and decent and kind. I am not done yet. I closed the journal and whispered, I am not done yet. It didn't feel powerful. It felt like a whisper in the dark. But it was the first real thing I had said to myself in weeks. Rock bottom, I realized, wasn't the end. It was the place where I could finally hear myself think. Without interruption, without correction, without shame. It was where I stopped asking for permission to matter. And in that stillness, something small stirred inside me. Not strength, not yet, but the beginning of it. It was raining the day I found it. Not a dramatic storm, just a soft gray drizzle, the kind that makes the world feel hushed. Ria had gone to visit a friend in town, and I had the house to myself. I was restless that morning, pacing between the kitchen and the den, too tired to read, too anxious to sit still. I ended up in the attic. Ria's attic wasn't dusty or cluttered like most. She was a meticulous organizer, every box labeled, every memory stored with care. I told myself I was just looking for an old blanket, something to wrap around my shoulders while I sat on the porch. But I think deep down, I was searching for a version of myself I hadn't seen in decades. I found a box labeled Elenya from Mom's house. She must have saved it after our mother passed. I didn't even remember it existed. I sat on the floor and opened the box slowly, like it might breathe. Inside were papers, old letters, childhood drawings, a few yellowed photographs of me and Ria with skinned knees and wild curls. Underneath them, tucked between 2 notebooks, was a thin binder wrapped in a cracked leather band. I knew what it was before I even opened it. My manuscript, his hollow vows, the one I had written in my early 30s back when the kids were small and Victor was still new enough to fool me. I had written it late at night after putting Marielle and Caleb to bed. While Victor fell asleep in his study with the TV on, I scribbled in notebooks, typed on an old desktop, poured my heart into fictional characters who bore an uncanny resemblance to real ones. But I never finished it. Victor once called it a hobby. Said, "It's nice you have something to keep you busy while the kids nap." And somewhere along the way, I believed him. Believed it didn't matter, that it wasn't good enough, that I wasn't good enough. But holding it now, decades later, pages bent and ink fading, I felt something shift in my chest. My hands trembled as I opened the first page. My name was scribbled in the corner, along with a date. October 17th, 1992. I remember that night. Caleb had a fever. Victor had left me alone with both kids and gone to some fundraiser. That night, after everyone was asleep, I had started writing. The story was simple. A woman married to a man she didn't recognize anymore. A life full of carefully folded linens, calendar reminders, and empty conversations. A woman who had a secret, not an affair or a scandal, but a voice buried deep inside her that was begging to speak. As I read, I didn't feel pain. I felt recognition. Line after line, I saw her, the woman I used to be. Still young, still believing that love could be reshaped if she just tried hard enough. The metaphors were clumsy. Some dialogue felt forced. But there was truth in it. A raw honesty I hadn't allowed myself to speak aloud for years. And then I reached a line I didn't remember writing, but that hit me like an open palm. He loved the version of me that needed him. But the moment I grew, he stepped back into the shadows. I closed the binder and held it against my chest. There it was, the thing I had been trying to name. Victor didn't fall out of love with me. He fell out of comfort with who I was becoming. Every time I showed independence, curiosity, voice, he retreated. And I learned, slowly, painfully, to shrink myself to keep the peace. But now, there was no peace to keep, no house to maintain, no performance to give. It was just me, sitting on an attic floor, holding the truth I had written with my own hand before I even knew how badly I'd need it. I spent the next 2 hours reading the entire thing, word by word. Some pages made me smile, others made me weep, not because they were sad, but because I missed the woman who had written them. She had been so brave, and I had abandoned her. When I finished, I didn't hesitate. I took the binder downstairs, opened Ria's old laptop, created a folder titled Elenya Now, and I started typing. No grand plan, no outline, just muscle memory, emotion, truth. The words came fast, faster than they had any right to. I typed for hours, only stopping when Ria returned home and gently touched my shoulder. "What are you working on?" she asked, peeking at the screen. I turned to her, eyes red but alive. "I found my book," I whispered, "the one I thought didn't matter." She pulled up a chair and said, "Read it to me." I did. That night, in the soft light of a quiet home, I read the first few chapters of a story I had written decades ago. A story that somehow had been waiting for me to be ready. Not just to write it, but to own it. And for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt whole. It didn't happen like in movies. There was no sudden montage of me jogging at sunrise or cutting my hair while music played in the background. It was quieter than that. It began with a paragraph. The next morning, I woke early, before Ria even stirred. I made myself a strong cup of tea, settled into the corner of her small reading nook, and opened the laptop again. I reread the last few lines I had typed the night before. Then, without hesitation, I kept going. The words didn't rush. They trickled. But each one felt like reclaiming a part of myself I thought had died. Writing had once been the part of me that felt closest to truth. Not the truth of facts or schedules or polite small talk, but the truth of feeling, of seeing something clearly and putting it into language that made it real. I used to think I was just sentimental. Victor always said I felt things too deeply, like that was a flaw I should have corrected in my 20s. But now, as the sun rose gently through the window and warmed my hands on the keyboard, I didn't care if I was too much. I had spent 35 years being less, and it had nearly cost me everything that made me who I was. That morning, I wrote for 2 hours. Then I closed the laptop and took a long walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, scented faintly with pine and something floral. It wasn't anything special, but I noticed it, really noticed it, for the first time in weeks. I remember stopping near a small flowering tree just beyond Ria's fence. I stood there for a full minute, watching bees drift lazily between petals. It was such a small thing, but it reminded me I was alive. That was the moment I knew I wasn't broken. I was just waking up. Rhea noticed the change, too. "You're humming again," she said one afternoon, passing me in the kitchen. "I didn't realize I'd stopped." "You stopped years ago," she said. "You just didn't know it." She was right. I had been asleep inside my own life for so long that I had forgotten what my voice sounded like when it wasn't trying to please someone else. I wasn't angry. That surprised me most. I didn't walk around imagining ways to get back at Victor. I didn't fantasize about revenge or regret. What I felt was something simpler: clarity. I could see now how I had slowly disappeared. Not because he demanded it, but because I thought love meant sacrificing the parts of myself that made him uncomfortable. I remembered the night I turned down a teaching offer at a community college because Victor had said, "Do you really want to deal with grading papers at your age?" I remembered how I used to write essays and hide them in drawers, how I skipped my book club meetings to host his clients for dinner. None of those things were huge betrayals, but together they built a cage. And now I was stepping outside it. I emailed Joanna Lynn, an independent literary editor I had once heard speak at a small women's writing conference back in 2004. She wouldn't remember me, but I remembered her. She had said, "If your story won't let you sleep, it's probably meant to be shared." It had taken me 20 years to believe her. I typed a short message. "Dear Ms. Lynn, I'm an unpublished writer, recently separated after 35 years of marriage. I've written a novel, a blend of memoir and fiction, that I believe will resonate with other women who've been quietly erased inside their own homes. I'd be honored if you'd consider reading it. Thank you for your time. Warmly, Alenia Rowe." I attached the first 3 chapters and hit send before I could overthink it. That afternoon, I started outlining the rest of the book. Not because I thought it would sell, but because I had something to say. And I wasn't scared of being seen anymore. Later that week, I went to the local library, signed up for a free writing group that met on Wednesdays. I didn't tell them my life story. I just said, "I'm starting over." One woman clapped her hands and said, "Aren't we all?" I came home that night and laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Not at something clever, not at something polite, just the joy of hearing myself exist again. I began wearing the earrings Victor once said were too bold. I started putting fresh flowers by the window, not for guests, but for me. I stopped checking my phone every 10 minutes to see if he had called or texted. He hadn't, and I didn't need him to. Awakening wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about finally being allowed to be me. Without apology, without shrinking, without waiting for permission. I wasn't healed. Not fully. Some wounds take longer than a season to close. But I was awake now, and that was more than enough. When women leave, the world expects spectacle. They expect slammed doors, broken vases, maybe a car screeching down the driveway. But real change, the kind that holds, often comes with no sound at all. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't out to ruin anyone. I was simply rebuilding. Quietly, intentionally. For the first time in decades, my days were mine. The mornings started with tea and a laptop. Not just a paragraph here or there, but real work. Refining, shaping, pulling memories out like threads, and weaving them into a story that felt alive. Each time I typed Victor's fictional counterpart, Richard in the book, I noticed how detached I had become from the man himself. Not out of spite, but because I no longer needed his approval or presence to define my life. Joanna Lynn replied to my email 5 days after I sent the manuscript. The subject line read, "Your voice is sharp and necessary." Her message was short, but every word was oxygen. "Alenia, I read your first 3 chapters, twice. What you've written is not just a story. It's a mirror, for many women. For me, even. Please send the full manuscript when ready. Let's talk soon. Joanna. I sat there staring at the screen, my hand over my mouth. Not crying, just stunned. Someone had seen me. Not the wife, not the placeholder. Me. Ria walked in just as I reread the message for the third time. She smiled. You look like you've just won something. I turned the laptop toward her. She read it quietly, then said, You didn't win anything. You took it. That's different. That's better. I sent Joanna the rest of the manuscript the next day. She responded within 72 hours. Let's publish. Those 2 words changed everything. Not because they gave me power, but because they confirmed what I had started to believe on my own. My voice mattered. We agreed to publish under a pen name, E.R. Hollow. Not out of fear, but because the book wasn't about naming names or airing dirty laundry. It was about telling the truth of a life lived too quietly for too long. I didn't tell Victor. I didn't tell Marielle or Caleb either. I wasn't keeping secrets. I was setting boundaries. This was mine. Joanna and I worked in sync. She helped me restructure a few chapters, pushing me to go deeper. Less polite, she said once. Tell the truth, not the version you think people can handle. That stuck with me. So I rewrote entire sections. I added scenes I had once cut for being too emotional. I described the loneliness that came from hearing someone walk into the house and not feeling your heartbeat change. I detailed the subtle ways control wears pearls and says please and thank you. It was hard, but it was healing. While Joanna prepared the launch, a quiet release with small press interviews and podcast appearances, I did something else. Just as quietly, I opened a new bank account in my name. I called a financial advisor, someone recommended by Ria's friend, and started organizing my assets. I'd never handled our finances. Victor always took care of it. But now I was learning. I went through old documents, insurance, property agreements, tax returns. I saw in black and white just how much I'd let slip through my fingers over the years. Not just money, control, clarity, choice, the but no more. I signed up for a digital publishing seminar online. I didn't want to just publish one book. I wanted to understand the world I had been told I didn't belong in. I took notes. I asked questions. I connected with other women in their 50s and 60s who were launching second acts with nothing but grit and a Wi-Fi connection. There was no fanfare, no champagne, no you go girl moments, just quiet momentum. Every day I showed up for myself, a little more each time. At night, I would sit on Ria's porch with a throw blanket and reread chapters aloud, testing the rhythm, the weight of the words. Ria would nod, sometimes smile, sometimes wipe her eyes. You're not just writing a book, she told me one night. You're building a home where your truth can live. That hit me. I had spent 35 years building a house that never felt like mine. This book, these pages, they were bricks, windows, a front door I could finally walk through and say, this is mine. The official release was set for 3 weeks away. No billboards, no book tour, just a digital launch, a social media post, and a few feature spots in women's writing circles. But I didn't care about numbers. I cared that I had followed through, that I had kept going when it would have been easier to lie down, that I had done something, start to finish, without asking permission. Victor still hadn't called. He didn't know what was coming, not because I was planning to hurt him, but because, for the first time, he simply wasn't the center of the story. I was. And that was more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. The book came out quietly. No balloons, no headlines. No one in my old neighborhood even knew the woman behind his hollow vows was me. But still, it moved. At first, it was a trickle. A few emails, a handful of 5-star reviews. One woman from Georgia wrote, I've been married 42 years, and I've never heard anyone describe what it feels like to disappear so clearly. Thank you for giving me language. That line, giving me language, stayed with me for days. It was the thing I hadn't been able to name all those years. Not sadness, not even loneliness, but wordlessness. And now that silence was breaking. Joanna forwarded me messages from book clubs, therapists, women's circles. The book spread the way pain does, slowly, quietly, from one hand to another, like a whisper shared between survivors. It wasn't long before someone in Victor's world stumbled on it. Martin Claiborne, his longtime law partner and closest friend, was the first to call him. I didn't hear the conversation, of course, but I knew the moment it happened. Rhea was cooking dinner when I got the text from an unknown number. Is this about me? I stared at the message for a long time. My hand didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I simply put the phone down and said aloud, "He's just now realizing." I didn't respond. He didn't deserve answers. Not anymore. Within a week, more messages trickled in. Women Victor had worked with, friends from our old church, even an old neighbor. Just read his hollow vows. Beautiful, heartbreaking, courageous. I recognized him in those pages. I never said anything I should have. Still, I said nothing. I didn't gloat. I didn't reach out to correct or defend. I let the story speak. And somehow, silence became the loudest thing in the room. Victor called Caleb. I found out later from Caleb's voicemail, the one he left me after they spoke. "Mom." Dad seems rattled. He didn't say much, but he asked if you were okay. I told him you were doing more than okay. He didn't say anything after that. That was enough. Victor was losing something. Not status, not money, but control. The quiet grip he had on how I was seen, how our marriage was remembered. And for a man like him, that was everything. Martin, who had always been careful to remain neutral, finally cracked. He called Rhea's house and left a message. Rhea played it for me over dinner. "Tell Elenya if this is what I think it is. I'm sorry, I should have said something years ago. He wasn't fair to you. We all knew it." We all knew it. That sentence stuck in my ribs like a thorn. They knew, and they said nothing. But now, with a few hundred pages and a false name, I had done what they wouldn't. I had spoken. The power shift wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about the book's modest success. It was about how people looked at him now, and how they looked at me. I got an invitation to speak on a podcast hosted by two middle-aged women, both survivors of long, quiet marriages. I agreed. I didn't use my real name, but I told my real story. At the end of the interview, one of the hosts asked me, "What would you say if your husband was listening right now?" I paused, then said, "Nothing." He had 35 years to listen. Now, this story belongs to women who need it more than he ever did. That clip went viral. The next day, Joanna called me, nearly breathless. "You're everywhere, Elenya. Your silence, the way you hold it, and it's devastating. In the best way." I smiled, but it wasn't pride that filled me. It was relief. Because I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to beg to be seen. I just had to stop hiding. Victor sent one final message. "If you wanted to humiliate me, congratulations. You did." I read it twice, then deleted it. This was never about him. It wasn't revenge, it was release. And with each passing day, more and more women found the book, saw themselves in it, and stood a little taller. The story no longer belonged to me alone. And that was the real shift. I had spent decades holding a marriage together by staying small. Now, simply by existing in full, by telling the truth, I had created something bigger than both of us. And Victor? He remained silent. But this time, the silence didn't come from me. It happened in a bookstore, not a flashy event hall or a staged interview, just a small independent shop in western Massachusetts that smelled of paper and dust and old hardwood. The owner had read his hollow vows and invited E.R. Hollow for a reading and Q&A. It was late October. The trees outside were fire-colored. Inside, it was warm, quiet. About 30 people had shown up, mostly women, some alone, some sitting with friends and folded arms across their chests, like they were protecting something still tender. Joanna had encouraged me to say yes. "You don't have to explain who you are," she said. "Let your words do what they've always done." So I did. I wore a simple navy blouse, a scarf around my neck, and no makeup beyond a little lipstick. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to stand in the full weight of my truth, with my spine straight and my voice steady. I read 3 passages from the book. The room was silent, not from disinterest, but from attention so focused it hummed. Then the moderator opened the floor to questions. Most were thoughtful. "How long did it take to write? Did you base this on a single person or multiple? What gave you the courage to publish?" I answered honestly, if vaguely. I didn't name Victor. I didn't have to. Anyone who had lived a certain kind of marriage knew exactly who he was, whether they called him Richard, Mark, or Daniel. Then came a woman in the second row. She looked about 60, gray hair pulled into a clip, long brown coat, a notebook in her lap. She raised her hand. "Was the man in your book your real husband?" she asked. For a moment, I hesitated. I looked at her, at the women beside her, at the rows of silent eyes that waited, and I said simply, "Yes, he was." I didn't elaborate. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. That single word felt heavier than any confession. It didn't need drama. It just needed honesty. But that wasn't the reveal. That came afterward. As the event wound down, people lined up to have their books signed. Most didn't speak. They just pressed the paper back into my hands, whispered, "Thank you," and moved on. A few wiped away quiet tears. One woman gave me a small wrapped chocolate and said, "For your voice." Then, near the end of the line, I saw him. Victor. He stood awkwardly in the doorway in a crisp wool coat, hands clasped behind his back like a man preparing to testify. My stomach didn't drop. My heart didn't flutter. I felt still. He hadn't shaved that morning. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically. Like he didn't know what to do in a room where he wasn't automatically respected. When he stepped forward, the room seemed to tense, though only a few people recognized him. He wasn't famous, not publicly, but he'd been known enough in legal circles. He cleared his throat and said, "May I have a moment?" I stood up from behind the table. The room fell silent. I looked at him, really looked at him, and what I saw wasn't a villain. It was a man who had built a life around being the center of every room and now had no idea where to stand. "I read it," he said. His voice was low, but not shaking. "The book." I waited. He continued, "You didn't lie. Not once. That's what scares me the most." He looked down, then added, "I don't expect forgiveness. I didn't know it had hurt you that much, that you were that alone." I stepped closer, still calm. "You didn't know because you never asked." He blinked, then nodded slowly. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. "I came because I realized something. People are talking about this book in places I can't control, and instead of being angry, part of me feels relieved. Because maybe now, someone sees what I never took the time to." I looked at him. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with clarity. "You don't need to carry this with me anymore," I said. "I carried it alone for 35 years. You're free now, but so am I." He opened his mouth to respond, closed it, then simply nodded and turned to leave. He walked out without looking back, and I didn't follow. That was the real confrontation. Not rage, not accusation, but standing in my truth. Steady and still and letting it speak louder than any apology ever could. Later, after everyone had left, I sat in the empty bookstore and exhaled. I hadn't planned for him to show up. I hadn't rehearsed what I'd say, but somehow I'd said exactly what needed to be said, without raising my voice, without trembling, without trying to make him understand, because I no longer needed his understanding. to feel whole. It came 2 weeks after the bookstore event. I was folding laundry at Ria's, the mundane kind of afternoon that usually passes without notice. Clean socks, the scent of lavender detergent, a breeze through the window. My phone buzzed. A message from Joanna. "Call me when you're free. There's something you should know, and it's big." I called immediately. She answered on the first ring. "Elenya, are you sitting down?" "I'm standing in a pile of towels," I replied. "But I can sit." I sat on the edge of the couch, already feeling something turn in the air. Joanna took a breath. "There's a legal inquiry into Victor's old firm. A journalist who read his hollow vows recognized details from your story. Things about how Richard and his partner buried harassment claims, manipulated settlements, misused client funds. She's connecting dots, quietly, carefully." I was silent. Joanna continued. "She's been digging, cross-checking character traits, timelines, quotes, and she reached out to several women who used to work at the firm. They confirmed patterns." I closed my eyes. I had never intended this. I hadn't written the book to expose misconduct, not in a courtroom sense. I wrote it to survive, to be heard, to put an end to my own erasure. But now it seemed that story had started a ripple. One I couldn't stop, one I didn't want to. Joanna paused, letting the weight of it settle. Victor might be facing disciplinary review by the Bar Association, possibly worse. His partner, Martin, has already stepped down. The whispers are growing louder. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was seen. Not because a man was about to face consequences, but because the truth had reached beyond me. It had grown legs and a spine, and it had chosen to walk out into the world without fear. After we hung up, I sat alone on the couch, a clean pillowcase still in my lap. I stared out the window, the trees swaying gently like they knew. I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't crying either. I was still. That night, I read back through a few pages of my book, the chapter where Richard dismisses his secretary's complaint, suggesting she misunderstood his tone. I remembered when Victor said those exact words in real life, over dinner, like it was a joke. I remembered how my stomach turned. And now that very sentence had landed in someone else's notebook. A journalist. A woman who didn't laugh, who didn't look away. That was the twist. Not that he was being investigated, but that my small, quiet voice had become part of something larger. Not just personal truth, but public consequence. I received an email the next day. It was from a woman named Angela Ruiz, a paralegal who worked at Claiborne and Rowe for 9 years. She had read the book. She had recognized the patterns. "I just wanted you to know. Your story helped me come forward. I thought I was crazy. I thought it was normal to feel invisible in that office. Turns out, it wasn't me. It was them." She attached her written statement to the review board. I stared at the document. It was 6 pages long, clear, calm, brutal. Victor had always surrounded himself with silence. Loyal men, loyal wives, loyal systems. But now the silence had broken, and he couldn't control what came next. Ria poured tea for us that evening. She'd been quiet since I told her. "You okay?" she asked, placing the mug in front of me. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but I'm not sorry." She sat down across from me. "You didn't accuse anyone, you just told the truth. What they did with that truth, that's on them." I nodded. It was strange. For so long, I had felt powerless, like my entire identity had been bound to how gently I could disappear without making a mess. And now, without lifting a finger, without shouting or pointing or demanding, the truth had done the work for me. That was the justice I never saw coming. Not revenge, not scandal, just accountability, delivered by the very voice they had trained me not to use. A week later, an official complaint was filed against Victor's firm. Several former employees submitted supporting evidence. The journalist published an article, Anonymous sources, but anyone with sense could read between the lines. Victor's name wasn't directly printed, but he wasn't a mystery anymore. His world began to shrink. Clients pulled out. Old friends stopped answering calls. He stepped down from the firm quietly, citing health reasons. No one believed it. And me? I kept writing. I started a second book, not about him, about the process of reclaiming life after silence. I called it Louder Than a Whisper. Joanna loved the title. Powerful, she said, and earned. I wasn't vindictive. I didn't throw parties. I didn't tell Marielle or Caleb what was happening unless they asked. Caleb knew, vaguely. Marielle didn't speak of it. But I was okay with that, because justice, when it's real, doesn't need an audience. It just needs to land. And this time, it landed where it belonged. It was late afternoon when I saw her name flash on the screen. Marielle. I hadn't heard her voice in months. We had exchanged a few polite texts after I left. Nothing heavy, just calendar updates and check-ins about Caleb. Nothing that touched the truth. She had always been closer to Victor. She admired his poise, his structure, his control. She once told me, "Dad is steady, Mom. You're more soft." At the time, I took it as a compliment. Now I saw what she meant. I was soft, too soft for too long. And she had grown up believing strength looked like detachment. The phone rang once, twice. I picked up on the third. "Hello?" There was a pause, then, "Hi, Mom." Her voice was gentle, careful. "I hope this isn't a bad time," she added. I leaned back into the couch. "Number not at all." Another pause. Then she said it. "I read your book." I waited. I didn't realize. I thought you were just quiet. I thought you liked the background. I closed my eyes, not from pain, but from the fragile beauty of that sentence. My daughter, for the first time, had seen me not as a function, but as a person. I didn't know how to say it out loud, I told her softly. Marielle's voice cracked. "I don't know how I missed it." I didn't say, "Because you never looked." I didn't say, "Because your father taught you not to." I had no need to shame her. This moment wasn't about blame, it was about truth meeting truth. She exhaled on the other end. "I guess I always thought we were okay. You and Dad. We weren't the most affectionate family, but we weren't broken." "No," I said, "we weren't broken. We were quiet. There's a difference." Silence hung between us. But not the old kind. Not the silence that hurt. This one was reflective, respectful, like we were both digging through something together. "I want to see you," she said finally, "if you're open to it." My heart ached, not with sadness, but with hope that was careful, cautious, but real. "Of course," I replied, "whenever you're ready." She came 3 days later. No warning, no ceremony, just a knock on the front door of Ria's house, and there she was, standing in a cream sweater, her hair pulled back in that tight, clean bun she always wore. She looked older than the last time I saw her, not in years, in knowing. She stepped inside, hugged me, properly hugged me, and whispered, "I'm sorry." We sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The sun was gentle, filtered through the branches above. Marielle didn't press. She didn't ask me to walk her through every memory she missed. She just sat beside me, present, like someone who finally understood the value of presence. She glanced down at her cup. "He's not taking it well. The fallout." I nodded but said nothing. "I think he thought people would defend him, or at least doubt you." I gave a small smile. He spent his life being believed. I spent mine being doubted. This was always going to shake him more than it shook me. Marielle didn't defend him. She didn't shift uncomfortably or say it was complicated. She just let the words hang there. Then she asked a question I didn't expect. "What do you need from me, Mom?" I looked at her, truly looked at her, not as the little girl I had raised, but as the grown woman who had walked into this moment of her own will. "I don't need anything," I said gently, "but I'd like to know you, the real you, and I'd like for you to know me, not just as your mother, as Ilenia." She nodded slowly, her eyes glassy. "I think I'd like that too." We didn't say much more. We didn't have to. The door wasn't blown open, but it was cracked now. There was light coming through. That was enough. A week later, Caleb visited. He brought his guitar, played for me on the porch while Rhea made dinner inside. After he finished, he looked at me and said, "I never thanked you for how much you carried." I shook my head. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," he said, "because I used to wonder why you stayed quiet, and now that I know, I wish I had listened sooner." I rested my hand on his. "You see me now. That's all I ever wanted." The truth was, I wasn't trying to reclaim my children's loyalty. I didn't need them to choose sides. I just wanted them to see clearly, to understand that love doesn't always mean presence, and silence is not always peace. I wasn't their shield anymore. I was their mirror, and for the first time, they were looking into it with open eyes. It was a Sunday morning, the quiet kind with pale light spilling across the floorboards and the smell of brewed tea drifting softly from the kitchen. Rhea had gone to town. Marielle had flown back 2 days ago. Caleb had hugged me before leaving the night before, his goodbye lingering longer than usual. I was alone, but for the first time in years, I wasn't lonely. I walked barefoot across the porch, a small journal tucked under my arm, and settled into the old rocking chair that creaked just enough to feel human. Across the lawn, a robin picked at the soil beneath the hedges. There was a stillness in the air, not the cold stillness of a lifeless room, but the kind that comes after a storm has passed, when you finally realize the roof held. I opened the journal and wrote one line at the top of the page. "He never loved me." But I do. I didn't mean Victor. I meant me. There was no ceremony in that moment, no stream of tears, no music swelling in the background, just breathe, just warmth, just peace. I had spent 35 years trying to hold together a version of love that was slowly erasing me. I gave loyalty, silence, service, thinking they were enough to make a man see me, and when he didn't, I thought maybe I hadn't given enough. But now I knew. I didn't leave because he stopped loving me. I left because I finally realized I deserved to be known. Fully, not faintly. I deserved to be asked how I felt, to be missed when I left the room, to be remembered not just as a caretaker, a meal planner, a name on paperwork, but as a woman with a mind, a voice, a soul. And I had found her again, slowly, through pain, through pages, through silence turned into ink. The book, His Hollow Vows, had made its way into the hands of women I would never meet, and they reached back. Letters, emails, folded notes slipped across tables after readings, all of them telling me, "Me too. I thought it was just me. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." That was the real ending. Not Victor stepping down from the firm, not the firm's name being quietly changed, not the messages from people who suddenly saw him differently. It was this: a single woman on a porch with her journal, no longer invisible to herself. Rhea came back mid-morning with flowers, peonies my favorite. She placed them on the table and said, "I thought the house should smell like spring." I smiled. It already does. That evening, I walked down to the creek by the woods. I hadn't been there since I first arrived. It was small, barely more than a stream, but the water moved steadily, as if it knew exactly where it was going. I sat on a large rock at the edge and closed my eyes. I thought about the girl I used to be, newly married, full of hope, convinced she'd be the exception, that her love would melt even the coldest hearts. That patience could fix anything. I thought about the woman I became, cautious, quiet, always folding herself smaller to fit the room she was given, And then I thought about now. I was not angry. I was not bitter. I was free. The justice hadn't come in courtrooms or grand reckonings. It had come in self-return, in seeing my reflection and not flinching, in knowing I could stand tall without waiting for applause or permission. I stood up and walked back through the woods, not hurried, not hesitant, just sure. When I reached the porch again, Rhea was waiting with 2 mugs of chamomile. We sat in silence, but this time, it was the good kind. Not all stories end in fireworks. Some end in soft resolve, in knowing who you are and deciding that's enough. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or quietly replaced, leave a comment below. You're not alone. Have you ever walked away from something that stopped seeing your worth? Share your moment in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories like this one, and tap the bell so you never miss a voice that deserves to be heard. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away in silence and write yourself back into the story.